Welcome to the Den of Dissent. This is a show where we challenge the current culture and mainstream talking points of the day. What is the news telling us? What is the culture telling us? Where is our civilization headed? And by what standard do we judge these issues? Do you agree or do you dissent? Let's find out. What's up, people? Welcome back to the show. Before we get into it, I want to talk about Liberty Classroom. It's a course that you can take if you want to learn about history, world history, American history. You want to learn about the presidents, the good guys, the bad guys, Western civilization, what makes for a good civilization, what makes for a good government, what is good money, what is sound economics. How did Western civilization become so developed? What was it about Western civilization and other civilizations that made them great? You will find out, and how you can potentially make your civilization great as it stands right now, because seems like we're collapsing. But anyway, we're talking about slavery today, and I thought this would be a good source to promote. It was developed by Tom Woods. Tom Woods is an economist, lecturer, author, and he says, your U.S. history class was 100% propaganda. Are you ready for truth? So many kids fresh out of school believe preposterous things like poverty declines because of government anti-poverty programs. Myth. The most significant factor keeping minorities behind is racism. Myth. The government has our best interests at heart. Myth. A bomb didn't go off. Centralized power is a force for good and people who resist it are evil. Myth. Without government, kids would be working in mines for 10 cents an hour. Another myth. People who use the expression America first are Nazis or Nazi sympathizers. Myth. So you will learn so many truths in this course, and you will be able to destroy and refute all these false talking points that you hear on and on again from the mainstream media to academic institutions. On and on it goes. And I highly recommend it. I'm gonna post a link in the description along with my Instagram and my Cash App link if you want to support your boy. Yes, get some truth in your life. Today we're going to talk about slavery. I'm going to have 2 parts, so make sure you check out part 2 as well. On that note, let's get started with the show. Check out Liberty Classroom. Peace. What's going on, people? I am back once again. So today we're going to talk about something a little different. I know all of this, the political shenanigans are taking place. We just saw an attempted assassination. Kamala Harris is in the race. There's just so many different directions I could go right now. But, those things become so convoluted, and I'm not going to touch on those things right now, but at a later point, I probably will. But anyway, I want to talk about slavery. That's your favorite topic, slavery. So today, we're going to talk about some interesting facts about slavery that you don't hear too often. Sometimes you don't even hear these things at all. But I'm going to read this article, and when you hear some interesting things, maybe take some notes. Go do your Googles on these things that I bring up. So, because we have I think a misconception or maybe a twisted perception about slavery. Sometimes we only view it through a certain lens. So I think this will open up some conversations. But anyway, let's get into it. This article I'm reading from is from the New American, written by Steve Bias. It's called America Did Not Invent Slavery. It Ended Slavery. This is an older article. But anyway, let's start. It says, a few years ago, I sat in church and listened to a preacher, a substitute for my pastor, who declared from the pulpit, what a great and courageous man was William Wilberforce, the famous English abolitionist. The pastor then lamented that it was unfortunate that America did not have a William Wilberforce. He says, it is unfortunate that so much historical misinformation comes from the mouths of well-meaning individuals such as this minister, but his statement illustrates the success of those who are not so well-meaning. those who want to distort history to advance the cause of the left. To the secular progressives who largely run our institutions of education from kindergarten to graduate school, the mass media, the entertainment world, and now the corporate world, the issue is never the issue. The issue is power. So, that right there, that just says a lot. The fact that our schools, our institutions, the colleges, the media is controlled by a particular group, secular progressive, secular meaning that they don't really believe in God, they don't have a foundation, and definitely the biblical God, the God of Isaac, Jacob, and Abraham. So these are secular people that run these institutions. So you're only going to get this kind of worldview. And this is where we're getting a lot of our information from. And these are the worldviews, the secular worldviews are the worldviews that dominate our information, our power centers, college, media, and so forth. So it's no wonder when you get into conversations about slavery or other topics that you're only going to get this point of view, and like the truth a lot of times is just suppressed, and you're not getting the true perspective or the true point of view. You're just getting this one-sided view from these secular progressives. And it's like, it's very contagious. You see it throughout the world, and just when you have daily conversations with people. Anyway, let me go on. He says the 1619 Project, promoted by the New York Times, is a bold effort to undermine the foundations of our constitutional republic by asserting that America was founded not in 1776, but rather in 1619, when the first Black Africans were brought to Virginia. According to this thesis, which is unsupported by the historical record, America was founded on the backs of African slaves, and practically every aspect of American history, including our Constitution, was tainted by the desire to implement and preserve the institution of slavery. This is what the 1619 Project is saying. He says, therefore, since America was founded on slavery, its founding is illegitimate, which means it needs to be transformed into a nation more to the liking of the secular progressives who promote this fictional view of U.S. history. Students emerge from our schools believing that not only was our country founded on slavery, but America originated slavery and only abolished it after just about nearly every other country had already done so. Historian Kenneth Stamp promoted this ahistorical view in his book, Peculiar Institution: Slavery in the Antebellum South. In truth, slavery was neither peculiar nor original to English America or later, the United States. Writing in 1619, Jamestown and the Forging of American Democracy, James Horne explained that by the time the first Africans arrived in Virginia, 500,000 slaves had already been shipped across the Atlantic to work in Spanish America and Brazil, Portugal's New World colony. The late Walter E. Williams, the renowned economics professor at George Mason University, expressed similar sentiments in May 2019, calling such false assertions as America created slavery a favorite leftist tool, Williams wrote. Slavery is by no means peculiar, odd, unusual, or unique to the U.S. If you don't know who Walter Williams is, you should check him out. He's one of my favorite just thinkers. Great economist, very witty, funny guy. Very, he can be sarcastic, but just practical in terms of how he talks about economics. Check him out. Anyway, says the historical record is quite clear. Rather than originating in colonial America, slavery has existed since we have had recorded history and before. References are made to slavery as early as 3500 BC in ancient Sumer, the world's first great civilization, founded in Mesopotamia, now in modern Iraq. The famous Code of Hammurabi of Babylon mentions laws concerning slavery around 1860 BC. Slavery was part of the societies of ancient Egypt, China, Persia, Greece, India, the Roman Empire, the Arab Islamic Caliphate, the pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas, such as the Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Incas, and the early kingdoms of Africa. Individuals were slaves for various reasons, including debt slavery, punishment for crimes, child abandonment, and as prisoners of war. Some were born into slavery. When Atlanta was being considered for the 1996 Olympics, members of the Olympic Committee from West Africa expressed misgivings about locating the games in Georgia, a place where slavery existed prior to its abolition in 1865. Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young countered that while white Americans purchased slaves from Angola and other places in Western Africa, it was the ancestors of the Africans themselves who sold them into slavery. This is true. Almost all these sold into the Atlantic slave trade were sold by Black African kingdoms who had already enslaved them in Africa. So let's stop there. A lot of times people, they talk about slavery and they just pinpoint America, and they just completely forget about the fact that slavery has existed, like I just read, for centuries. It's probably the most common economic, or most common form of economics throughout the world. So it's been going on since the beginning of time. And it's like people just forget about all the other countries that practice slavery, and all the years that slavery was practiced throughout the world. They just fast forward all the way to America, and they just highlight America for whatever reason. And America just gets the blame. You don't hear about, the Roman Empire getting the blame for slavery. They don't talk about the Arab Islamic Caliphate. They don't talk about Egypt. I mean, you do hear about it sometimes, but America just seems to take the cake and just get highlighted when it comes to slavery. When you think of slavery generally, a lot of people just they bring up America, and that's it. He also talks about Andrew Young, when they had the Olympics in Atlanta, and Andrew Young, white Americans he was talking about white Americans purchased slaves from Angola and other places in Africa. But he brings up a point in this article saying that, well, who sold the slaves to the whites, right? Who sold the slaves to the white Americans? It was the ancestors of the Africans who sold them into slavery. And he says that almost all of those sold in the Atlantic slave trade were sold by Black African kingdoms who had already enslaved them in Africa. And I've heard people say, oh, well, they were taught this by the white man, so they go back to blaming the white man for the Black man knowing what slavery is, and it was, the white, I don't know. Anyway, you know how the credibility, or not the credibility, but the blame, it's a lot of blame shifting going on sometimes, but people do forget that, yes, there was African kingdoms that were selling their people into slavery. So, people like to leave that out sometimes. Anyway, let's go on. He says, a really southern institution here, slaves from Guinea digging the gold and silver mines of Hispaniola, now Haiti, Dominican Republic, in 1595. The number of slaves used in the Spanish Empire was far greater than those in bondage in English America. You don't hear that too often. The number of slaves used in the Spanish Empire was far greater than those in bondage in English America. In fact, King Gizo of Dahomey in West Africa was angered when the British ended the slave trade. King Gizo, Black dude from West Africa, he says, quote, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth." The king of Bonny, now Nigeria, was also disappointed when the British ended the slave trade. So how many times have you heard about King Gizo from Dahomey in West Africa? Okay, when the British, the whites, they came in, King Gizo was like, listen, you guys are disturbing. You're disturbing this hustle that I got going on. I'm selling my people and I'm making some serious bread from this. Why are you disturbing my hustle? I got to sell my slaves. I got to get these slaves off. This is what King Gizo was basically saying. He said the slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It's the source and the glory of their wealth. And the British, the white man, ended the slave trade, is what's being said here. And you can look up William Wilberforce when he was an abolitionist, and he was uh, promoting the abolition of slavery. But anyway, you don't hear about my man King Gizo too often. Anyway, let's go on. And King of Bani, down Nigeria. Um, this, of course, brings us back to that preacher who rightly praised William Wilberforce, a member of parliament who struggled for years to end the slave trade and finally slavery itself in the British Empire. Wilberforce's career well illustrates why the slave trade and slavery came to an official end in the world. The death of the ugly institution of slavery was a result of Western civilization, and the greatest impetus to Western civilization's attack upon slavery was Christianity. Wilberforce became an ardent foe of slavery after his Christian conversion. Christianity had largely ended slavery in Europe in the early Middle Ages when many popes and other church fathers denounced it, and it was the conversion of Wilberforce in 1785 when he became an evangelical Christian that led to its eventual demise in the British Empire. A member of the House of Commons for 45 years, Wilberforce was finally able to get Parliament to end the slave trade in the British Empire in 1807. Then, only 3 days before his death in 1833, slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire. I noticed that when he talks about William Wilberforce being in the House of Commons for 45 years, he says in parentheses, it's a strong argument against term limits. So basically he's saying that if William Wilberforce had term limits, he wouldn't have been able to accomplish the things that he accomplished in the House of Commons. So he had 45 years to do that. If you would have given him a term limit of like 5 years, maybe he wouldn't have accomplished that. So I see that argument. Anyway, he goes on to say, but was it correct to lament that America did not have such a man as Wilberforce in our country? Actually, the institution of slavery had been under attack in America for several decades by men and women who decried the institution of slavery. Slavery was specifically declared illegal in Georgia when it became a colony in 1733, only to be legalized in 1750 by the King of England when it became a royal colony. When Vermont declared itself an independent republic in 1777, it abolished slavery at the same time. Vermont was made the 14th state in 1791. Other states that ended slavery included Pennsylvania in 1780, New Hampshire and Massachusetts in 1783, Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, New York in 1799, New Jersey in 1804. So you have all these states in America that were declaring it illegal. Georgia, when it became a colony, and then it became legalized in 1750 by the King of England, and so forth. So you have, again, these states in America that were abolishing it. You know, they were pushing for abolishing of slavery. So that's often left out. Instead of hearing that, what you hear is that America just invented slavery and it was just rampant slavery and it supports it, and America wants to bring slavery back, and if you vote for Trump, he's bringing slavery back and all of this, you know. But you don't hear about the fact that abolition was a popular thing, and states were actually pushing abolition and they were against slavery. Now, obviously, there was people that were pro-slavery as well, so we're not going to leave that out. But you don't really hear the other side. Going on. Another early action against slavery was taken in 1787 when Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, now the present states of Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Interestingly, this was done at the insistence of Thomas Jefferson, who had tried to insert a condemnation of the slave trade into the Declaration of Independence. All of these dates prove that rather than being tardy in attacking the institution of slavery, America was the world's leader in bringing the practice to an end. While Wilberforce is rightly commended for his multi-year struggle to abolish slavery in the British Empire, he did not accomplish that feat until 1833. By that time, slavery had been ended or was being ended in several states in the United States. In some places, more than a generation earlier than in the British Empire. And it is not just that America's abolition of slavery was accomplished earlier than in the British Empire. Abolition in America predated almost the entire world. While Peter the Great abolished outright slavery in Russia in 1723, he converted Russians into serfs. And it was not until 1861 that serfdom finally ended in Russia. Mexico abolished slavery in 1829. France initially abolished slavery in 1794, but it was reestablished by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1802, before being permanently ended in the French colonies in 1848. So he's saying here that America was America was not the last to abolish slavery. America had already started this trend earlier than the British Empire and even the Russians. So he's saying that America was pretty much one of the first to promote the abolition of slavery, and it predated almost the entire world. And I find it interesting in Russia that Russia was late to the abolishing the abolition party, because he's talking about Russia, not really getting rid of slavery until the 1800s, 1860s, and 1829, and it was and then he talks about the French colonies as well. So again, you don't hear about that when it comes to slavery in America. You don't hear that America was one of the first to promote abolition and to get rid of slavery, and the rest of the world followed, which is interesting. I'm not saying it was the very first, but he's saying that it was one of the first countries to push abolition for slaves. Let's go on here. He says it's not just a white thing. Perhaps the most prolific slave masters of the Middle Ages were the Arabs. Here we see a painting of black Africans by Muslim slave traders in 13th century Yemen. So for those not watching a video, if you're not watching a video, click on the YouTube link. You can watch it. If you're just listening, then yeah, there's a picture of some Arabs or Muslim slave traders in the 13th century. And they're slave masters of black Africans. He goes on to say the abolition of slavery came to Bolivia in 1851, Ecuador in 1852, Peru, Argentina, Venezuela in 1854, the Netherlands in 1863, Paraguay 1869, Cuba 1886, Brazil 1888. Abolition happened even later in other parts of the world, such as Korea, China, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. So again, all these countries are hopping on the abolition bandwagon a little late after America. It says, although now officially illegal in all countries, the institution still exists, with an estimated 25 to 40 million now enslaved in Asia and large numbers still enslaved in Africa. Children work as slaves today on cacao plantations in Western Africa, for example. While slavery was not abolished in all states of the United States until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, the U.S. Constitution provided that Congress could ban the importation of slaves into the country in 1807, which Congress did on March 2nd at the urging of President Thomas Jefferson. Wilberforce's bill had passed about a week earlier. So there was still some slavery going on. And even now, some people are saying that with the 13th Amendment, that's legal slavery, and it's basically saying that slavery is still still in existence, because if you're a prisoner or something like that, you can be a slave, which I don't know if that's a good argument. So, the slave hustlers, I would say some of them, I shouldn't characterize everybody who believes in that as a slave hustler, but some people, they don't want to kill the idea of racism and slavery. They want to keep it alive, and so they when they talk about the 13th Amendment, they just say, "Oh, that's legalized slavery." They can't just give the U.S. credit for abolishing slavery, or the founders for being, or the founders, some of the founders for being abolitionists. They can't just give them credit for that. They just always have to keep the slavery and the racism alive, and they turn the amendments into a pro-slavery thing. And so, anyway, you just can't win with certain people. Let's go on. Says indentured servants and slaves in America. Um, by that time, the importation of slaves was banned in 1807, and slavery was finally abolished in 1865. Slavery had existed in America since the 1600s, when it was still part of the British Empire. The 1619 Project airs, however, in asserting that slavery began in Virginia in 1619. The first black Africans who had been slaves in Africa did arrive in 1619. Let me say that again. The first black Africans who had been slaves in Africa, where were they slaves? They were slaves in Africa. Okay, so they came to America. Who was enslaving the Africans? The Africans. Okay, so they arrived in 1619, but they did not become slaves in Virginia. John Rolfe, a prominent resident of Virginia, reported their arrival to Sir Edwin Sandys, which took place on August 20th, 1619. A Dutchman of war of the burden of 160 tons arrived at Point Comfort. The commander's name, Captain Pope, his pilot for the West Indies, one Mr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. The Pope brought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor, Sir George Yearley, and Cape Merchant brought for victuals, food or provisions. He also goes on to say, famed historian Paul Johnson in his A History of the American People wrote, these men were unfree, though not strictly speaking slaves. They were indentured servants. White laborers arrived from England under the same terms, signing their indentures contracts or making their mark on them in the return for passage to America. So here, there's another point that's interesting. There were men that were unfree, not strictly speaking slaves, but they were indentured servants. So you had even whites that were, they were servants as well, and they had to work to get out of their contracts. They were white laborers that arrived from England, and you had black indentured servants too, is what's being said, and they had to work themselves out of their contracts in return for their passage to America. He goes on to say, in 1625, the black Africans were listed as servants, just like the white servants in that year's census. So again, that's something that's, again, not talked about very often. You don't hear about, sometimes you hear about indentured servants, but you don't hear about blacks being indentured servants, or you don't hear about whites being indentured servants. You just hear mainly about black slavery. That's it. He goes on to say, laws governing slavery would not exist in Virginia for several more years. Historians now believe that Rolfe may have been mistaken in writing that it was a Dutch ship that brought the first Africans to Virginia. It is now thought that 2 English pirate ships took over a Portuguese ship in the Gulf of Mexico, then went to Virginia with their cargo, which included African slaves from Angola. As there was no market for slaves in England, the men who had been slaves in Africa became indentured servants in Virginia. Indentured servants were generally released from their contract after a period of years and would usually be given some land on which to farm. While indentured servant status was not a pleasant existence, it was not slavery. It is not known whether any of these indentured servants from that first ship in 1619 lived to see both freedom and land, but many Africans who arrived in Virginia did. So here, he's saying that indentured servants were working to get themselves out of a contract. They were released from the contract after a certain amount of years. And after they got released, they would be given some land. They'd be given an asset. He's not, making it seem like it was heaven on earth, but it wasn't slavery. So the point that is often left out is that they were black indentured servants. They were black servants that had the opportunity to work themselves out of their contracts, to be released and get a piece of land, get some assets. But you don't really hear that. All you hear is slave, slave, slave. You were just beaten over the head. You got robbed. You got lynched. You were robbed of your resources. You were hijacked, this, and that. When was the last time you heard about a black indentured servant that was given a piece of land, that was given an asset after he worked himself out of a contract? When was the last time you heard something like that? You don't really hear that. Or all you're going to hear is you were a slave and you were impoverished. That's it. That's pretty much it. Now, again, we're not trying to make it seem as if being an indentured servant was, apple pie. But anyway, let's go on. Color me honest. As this map graphically demonstrates, slavery was generally abolished much earlier in parts of the United States than in most of the rest of the world. The common remarks that slavery was somehow unique or original in colonial America and the early United States is a massive falsehood. So you look at this map right here, and I guess the orange part would be the U.S., and that's around, let's see, 1800s, and then we got South America, which around the same time, and then we go to Africa, we go to the east, we go to Europe, and so forth, and you see the abolishing of slavery wasn't happening until late 1800s, 1900s, so forth. So that's pretty interesting. What else? He goes on to say, for example, Anthony Johnson was an Angolan who, after finishing his indenture, obtained land and became a tobacco farmer. By 1651, he had a 250-acre farm and 5 black indentured servants of his own. He even managed to own a slave before it was legal to do so. One of his black servants, John Casor, demanded his release in 1654 and went to work for a white man, Robert Parker. Johnson successfully sued Parker, and the court sentenced Casor to a lifetime of indentured servanthood as punishment for breaking the terms of his indenture. Let me go over that again. Anthony Johnson from Angola. I guess we could assume he's a black man from Africa. He finished his indentured servanthood and he got some land and he became a farmer. Once he did that, he got 5 black indentured servants that he owned, and I guess they had to work for their release. And he managed to own a slave before it was legal to do so. So here's a black man from Angola who owns another slave before it was legal. Okay, so here we go with the cycle again. Blacks enslaving blacks. One of his black servants, John Casor, wanted his release. He tried to get that. He went to go work for a white guy, right? He was tired of his black slave master. So he went to go work for a white guy. And Johnson sued the white guy. So the black African guy, right, from Angola, sues the white guy. And the court sentenced the servant the black servant to a lifetime of indentured servanthood. Have you ever heard that story where a black slave master can sue another white man for his black slave? The white man loses, the black servant gets sentenced to a lifetime of servanthood back to his black slave master. What kind of justice is that? I mean, when was the last time you even heard of that? Think of how crazy that sounds. And you always hear about, how the justice system is it's not in favor of black people and all of this. Where was this guy, Robert Parker? He was the white guy that the black slave ran to, right, to go serve. Where was Robert Parker? Where was his white privilege at the time? If there was ever a time to have some white privilege, wouldn't it be in the 1650s? Around that era, right? So even Robert Parker, a white guy, he couldn't even keep the slave. The courts ruled in favor of the black slave master, Anthony Johnson. The white guy, he couldn't keep John Kaser, the black slave. Think about that. Anyway, let's go on. It says, ironically, it could be argued that the first slave owner in Virginia was a former black indentured servant from Africa. Not until 1670 did Virginia enact laws governing actual slavery. Maryland had done so in 1664, when there were only 300 blacks in that colony. Still, few slaves populated any of the English colonies until the next century. The 1625 census of Virginia listed 23 blacks. In 1640, only 20 were identified in Maryland. It was this slow growth of the institution of slavery that historian Paul Johnson asserts that caused the gradual corruption of society to accept it. In other words, the people living at the time could not have predicted the eventual negative effects slavery would have on American history. By the time questions were raised about an institution that had existed throughout recorded history in all cultures and on all continents, the institution of slavery was deeply entrenched into the American culture and economy. Rather than creating the institution of slavery, many Americans fought to abolish it. It is simply incorrect to argue that America should have had a William Wilberforce when America had many like him. Quakers and Baptists were among the earliest abolitionists in colonial America. Thomas Jefferson spoke often of the evils of slavery. Quote, he says, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Jefferson said in reference to slavery. George Washington freed his slaves. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams both supported abolition. Be sure to check out part 2, link in the description.